Hello, welcome to Text on Texts. Today's discussion is with Chris Beddow. He runs a Substack called World Builder. He's a geospatial data engineer guy. He has a really interesting resume, super thoughtful guy. And we're going to discuss Jorge Luis Borges's On Exactitude in Science and a story called On the Impossibility of Drawing a Map of the Empire on a Scale of 1 to 1 by Umberto Eco. You'll also notice in the discussion that we reference a story called Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges. And I'm just going to go ahead and say, if you don't already own it, the collected fictions of Jorge Luis Borges, I have the version that's translated by Andrew Hurley. I think this is sort of the most common copy you see around. It's just like highly recommended. Like if you plan on listening to this podcast in the future, but also I think just like it's good life advice in general, this is an awesome book. I have not even come close to reading the whole thing. There's so many short stories in here. Many of them are very short, but they're extremely like dense and mind-blowing. But just go ahead and say it's a good book to have. But anyway, this is a great discussion. You're in for a treat. Chris is super thoughtful. So we recorded this in October of 2023. I'm publishing this like at the end of May 2024, just because, again, I'm barely keeping this thing going, but I love doing it. I'm going to keep doing it. It just takes a long time for me to get these things done. Since I had a chance to meet Chris, we actually met up and went skiing together in January in Switzerland, and he's just the coolest guy. I'm so glad he did this with us, and I hope you enjoy it. So thanks for listening, and yeah, let's go. Chris, thanks for doing this with me. Welcome to Text on Texts, a podcast that I still can't pronounce, sort of on purpose. I gave it a silly name. I heard somewhere that I was listening to Conan O'Brien's podcast with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he faced a lot of pressure to change his name when he was trying to make it in Hollywood. And he was emphatic that if it's difficult to remember, it'll be hard to forget. So that's what I'm going for here. I don't know if that's true. But
yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. But thank you for being on this with me. And I'll just start out asking you to introduce yourself and what you do, and then we can talk, get into what you're here to talk about. So
yeah,
how do you describe yourself?
Yeah. So my name's Chris. I'm originally from the USA. I live in Switzerland now, and I work very much in the geospatial industry, and that's a lot of my interest. I am not a software engineer by training. I would call myself something of a data engineer, data analyst now, but I probably came through an unusual path there. So mostly just an enthusiast of map data, and also very much into the concept of connecting different concepts from different fields of study and realms. So lots of things I like about maps that also come into things about geometry or literature or culture or languages. And I try to integrate that into my work, but where it's not appropriate there, I tend to try to find somewhere to write about it. So I have a blog called World Builder, where I try to also just write some kind of more mind-bending musings on maps and spatial technology.
Wonderful. That's great. And as I figure out how to do this podcast thing, this is the third interview I've done. So this is a lot of sort of meta discussion of the podcast, but our listeners will have to deal with it. I'm asking everybody, are you a technologist? Like all the guests I have to ask, like, do you consider yourself a technologist?
Yeah, I would say definitely so.
Yeah.
By accident, surely, but right. I think we maybe even have a similar way of coming into this term. Like I was listening to your podcast from a few months ago on minds behind maps, and just realized, yeah. I think, accidentally, yes, so a technologist.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's a fun question to ask, just because I think what even is technology, right? I tend to think like language itself is a technology, so anyone can be a technologist. So I'm glad you mentioned World Builder. That's how I found you. My like sort of original intention for wanting to even start this podcast was because of my love of Borges. I studied literature in undergrad and was just kind of blown away by Borges, and he just always sort of stuck in my mind as somebody very interesting. And then I started reading him again a few years ago and realized how practical Borges is from a like software engineering, like product design standpoint. I'm like, oh wow, this is very useful to think through infinity the way that he makes you think. And I thought it would be cool to have a college course called Applied Borges.
Nice. I like
aimed at like software engineers. And so, but I mean, I think as you know, the story that we're going to talk about today on exactitude in science is I don't know how many people who work in geospatial or in mapping use it when they give presentations. Like it's just become pretty standard. Like everyone, it helps that it's a short story that is literally a page long. So it's very easy to read. It goes down easy, but it opens up the concepts really well. But anyway, so that's how I found you, was through World Builder and your post about it. And I just wanted to, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. What prompted you to write that post, or like what was the motivation there? And maybe you can talk about Echo as well. But what spurred you there?
So overall, I think one of the first things that got me thinking about that maybe a couple of years ago is exactly what you mentioned. It's a very quotable short story. It fits in a slide if you wanted to show the whole story. It's literally a paragraph. But it's almost kind of overused in a way where you start to see it. It's almost like a ceremonial thing that someone will throw in a quote from it when they just start talking about something along the lines of metaverse, or something along the lines of 3D mapping, or like HD maps, or something that's one-for-one detail. And it's great because it is certainly relevant, but it kind of irked me a little that there's so much more to that than just saying like, oh, hey, look at this cool quote that like kind of relates to this. Now let's talk about 3D maps. Trying to like, I guess I was looking for anyone else's analysis of it. I was like, hey, where else does this get quoted? Or what does somebody think it means, when it was written decades ago, instead of quoting it in the context of, roughly 2020. And I came across this really funny publication on, it was on Google Books. They had, it came up as like a citation of it in this text by Umberto Eco, where I forget the name actually of this publication he had now. Like it's this bigger compendium of essays that had something to do with salmon and something else.
I have it here. It's called How to Travel with a Salmon.
Yeah, exactly. So very strange, right? And who even knew that exists? But I knew Umberto Eco's name from other things. I mean, just far more. I think, didn't he write like The Name of the Rose or something like these sort of fiction stories that are something similar to that. And I'm blanking on the name of the series, the one that Tom Hanks made the movies about, where he's kind of like tracking down medieval history and biblical mysteries.
Okay. What's the, gosh, yeah, I'm blanking on this too. Yeah, the Da Vinci Code type stuff. Okay.
Yeah, and that's kind of like a whole genre in its own, and he kind of is very much like an old figure in that. So that's his like fictional side, but he has this whole essay side. And so I came across this one, and it's just really funny in the citation is that he goes after Borges in this little concept he said of like, just imagine where there's a map, and they tried to make it one-for-one size of the empire, and it covered the whole Western deserts, and it's still left there today. And he kind of, in brief, comes at it like, that's not possible, and here's why. I'm going to break it down. And then he goes through just like page after page of evaluating this whole thing. So that prompted me to say like, okay, there's actually something really interesting, because what Borges has to say is cool as hey, like someone kind of thought of this before the technology existed. And then what Eco says is, oh, wow, here's like actually some of the problems that are a technical problem with kind of like detailed mapping or mapping in the cloud today that he points out unknowingly, but like, let's figure out how they actually are valid.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, I'll include links to your obviously your blog, your Substack, and then to the text, the Echo text. It's really worth reading because it is so funny. Like, I didn't expect that. I was like, it starts out very, as when I started reading, I was like, oh man, this is like so pedantic.
Yeah.
But it becomes very funny. To me, at least, I thought it was very funny. But yeah, I mean, like let's talk about this. I think one of the things that's so interesting about I think Borges's work, both on exactitude and science, and then another very famous one, the Library of Babel, is that he's describing very large and robust data structures or architectures, but using entirely analog media, right? So it's like, it's a map. It's just like, it's just a one-to-one map. So it's just laid out over, over the empire. And that's the way you're going to get the highest resolution map. And then the Library of Babel, same thing. It's like, okay, well, books are a way to store information. Like, so what if we had like all the information in books? Like, what would that look like? And you end up with a library that is, finite, sort of. I mean, it's finite theoretically, but like from a human standpoint, it's basically infinite. You would never be able to traverse that library or even find anything useful in it. And so, yeah, I think what Echo does right off the bat, he's just like, okay, well, first of all, it has to be a Cartesius or linen surface. So it's just like, it's just figuring out, okay, well, like what kind of paper are we talking about? In the first place, and all the problems that introduces. And then later he's like, okay, so the map isn't going to be accurate because it's going to block sunlight, and then things will deteriorate under that surface. So maybe gauze, some kind of gauze or see-through thing. And like, but it's fun to think through this idea of like a map, a library, gauze, paper, and like these are just media that they could conceive of at the time. And in your post, you talk about, S3, or like a Postgres database, which by our standards, who knows who's going to be doing a podcast in 100 years laughing at the idea of an object store, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, given what you do. I mean, can you explain just a little bit about like what you do now and how this is relevant to your work?
Yeah. So from a zoomed out perspective, I am a map data analyst. So I work mainly with kind of two aspects of map data. One is OpenStreetMap, and the other is Mapillary. So that's kind of like an open Street View platform that's also crowdsourced, just like OpenStreetMap.
Yeah.
And I try to make useful derivative pieces of information from those. So like figuring out where sidewalks are from 360-degree images in Mapillary is one of the main things I do now, and that eventually feeds into like filling in gaps in OpenStreetMap or any other kind of data sets where we just don't know what's walkable, and eventually turns it into what will in the future be, I think, kind of a more pedestrian-centered map that might be relevant for things like augmented reality, where you need to know what's around you in a lot more detail. And you can't just rely on having like 3 map layers, like buildings and roads and points of interest. You need a lot more about where you can walk and where you can cross a street, things like that. So I work in a lot of different ways of like trying to solve that problem, probably without being over specialized in any one aspect of it.
Right. And how do you see that, like your ability to solve those problems, or like how have you seen it improve throughout your career? I mean, just like in the short time you've been working on it, like have you seen sort of greater resolution become possible? I'm assuming yes, but I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, and there's so many aspects to it. I mean, one is just my own technical capability growing,
right?
And the other is like, okay, you're technically capable, but do you know how to use internal tools where you work, which are sometimes a totally different universe than the open source equivalent, and that's a learning curve. But beyond that, yeah, I've seen the technology itself improve. So there's things of when you have an image that's geotagged, figuring out if that's accurate. Did GPS work correctly? Is it in an urban canyon? How can you reposition an image based on other images around it relative to one another, which is an interesting thing to go into Borges on in a way, but also, yeah, relative to the actual position on the Earth. So really creative thinking has come in from a lot of people in different fields, like computer vision, spatial computing, computational geometry, to just make it possible to get an accurate position of something, especially in real time from like a mobile device, and to do it not just as in a GPS sense, but a visual sense. So that kind of stuff makes a huge difference in like this really simple end product of like, is this Starbucks really located on this corner, or is it like slightly around the corner? Like, where's the door, or how do you walk there?
Right. Well, yeah. Can you expand a little bit on that? This idea of like using like, I guess, images and how they relate to one another to make sense out of them. You said there was some Borgesian insight there or something. Yeah.
From let's go to like a coding perspective, and basically there's a library among kind of other similar things. There's this concept called structure from motion. So there's open SFM, structure from motion, that you can use in Python. And what that does is you can take a whole group of images. Let's say you have like 30 360 degree images, or maybe they're just forward facing images from your mobile phone. And this algorithm will take the pixels in them and kind of recreate a 3D scene. And so it will know, like, from this image, you're looking at a statue. From another image, you're looking at the same statue from a different angle, because we have the rough position, the camera angle, like how the camera's rotated. But then that kind of like works in a backward sense too, as you can tell if out of 10 images that all look at the statue, one is kind of off. You can say, well, the rest kind of agree, so let's pull this other one, and that like the position of the observer and the tilt of the camera and stuff are actually this, in order to match.
Right.
So you kind of like make a consensus, and then you find the outliers and make them agree. And it's sort of an adjustable thing, but what's interesting is how relative that is. And it comes into a lot of stuff that goes into that more literary sense of knowing kind of like what is your reality, and what do you compare it to, and how do you know which is which, or how do you choose like one measure to go off of and make everything else align to it. And a lot of concepts that are like it's very mathematical in the abstract, it makes sense, but when it comes to the real world and like putting stuff on a map, there really is like some absolute truth, and it's really hard to find for example, like where something's actually located. Like you can make it look right, but it might be slightly offset from where it should be in the real world. And then it's like, how do you verify that? There's a lot of complexity there. So yeah, that's where it gets blurry. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like the devices that we're using to instrument the world are, like you said, like the GPS might not be as accurate, right? There might be all sorts of issues with them, how they're calibrated. They're bugs, roughly. Just like to say broadly, like there are bugs in the system, and it's very seductive and easy for us to think that like, oh no, like these devices, like they're sensors, like they're not biased, like they'll tell the truth, and we can rely on them. But that's certainly not always the case. But then there's also the sense that they're just very limited in what they can sense, and how they sense things is different from how we sense things and make meaning out of things as well. So to your point, like the Starbucks is here, like you can put it on a map, but that doesn't help you know where the entrance is. Right.
Yeah.
And so
it's matching your spatial sense to kind of a ground truth or some model. And yeah, you have to adapt to it. I mean, when you look at Google Maps, this is something that's a little bit in that fractal map of blog post, and then some others as well. It's very interesting when you look at Google Maps on your phone, because that's what people expect, let's say from just like a product design perspective. That's what a map is. Right. And that kind of grows out of the original idea of holding a paper map in your hands. Probably like, I guess I was old enough to remember a little bit before you could use maps on your phone. So some people really remember that a lot. And it's really actually a design choice, was like, let's make looking at the phone feel like looking at the thing in your hand on paper. Yeah. But what's weird is it's hard to diverge from that. Like people expect that when I'm navigating New York City and I'm trying to get from the subway station to like a theater venue, I know that I want to look at this 2D thing that has roads in a certain way. It's very geometric. And so any new application that somebody makes is kind of based off of something like Google Maps, which is based off of MapQuest, which is based off of, going back and back. So doing something completely, totally new is really hard because people's mental model is not really easily adapted to that. Like we have a long tradition of it. So that's like the thing that everyone agrees upon is like how we relate our kind of like human sense of space to something digital is in that format.
Right.
But it could be done in many ways, right? Imagine that's
at least, I mean, how many thousands of years of map? Like I don't know what the oldest map is, but like, they've been around for a long time. Like this idea of like creating a 2-dimensional model of like what's going on out there is like the way we've done it for forever. And so you reminded me of Google Wave. Do you remember Google Wave?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. So it's a short-lived, I mean, not to poke too much fun at Google, but like, classic Google. Like it was, they announced this thing like tons of fanfare, this new thing, and it was like a collaborative. I don't even know how to describe it. I want to say document, but like they really blew up the notion of a document. They're like, why are we constrained by this model of a printed page? And so like having pages and margins and all that sort of stuff. It's like, you don't need any of that. Like you just need text and you need people to be able to like interact with and comment on the text. And so it was this totally wild way of like, I guess, creating documents, working on text together collaboratively with people. But it was free of the constraint of the notion of a page, of a printed piece of paper. And so you could just have very long strings. And then even within those strings, like you could sort of fork off of sentences and have comments on comments. Anyway, it just sort of allowed this sort of like very fractal way of editing things. This is years ago. I don't even remember. I might not be representing it right because I don't remember it. But like, anyway, it didn't work. People are like, wow, this is amazing. This is kind of cool to see like what's possible here. But I think to your point, like there's a lot of inertia that we have to push against if we're going to try to get people away from a model that everyone's used to.
Yeah. And there's a need for structure as well, right? So it sounds like something like Wave is not only a different way of approaching the same kind of tool, but like there's too many degrees of freedom, and that's really difficult sometimes as well, right? So, and maybe it works 10 years later. It was too early, and there's certainly products that have worked like more recently that maybe you remember like, hey, something existed in the 90s like that, but it didn't really stick. And now they're doing it again, but it's working, so it depends. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, so I found this other post that you wrote about like augmented reality and how like you navigate the world. You said something in it about how you don't have a problem or, you don't believe you have a problem that's going to be fixed by wearing like augmented reality glasses. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Like your thoughts on like how humans navigate the world and how that's different from like how a robot would?
I mean, it's very interesting when you think about something like augmented reality, and the big question is like, do we desperately need it? There's probably some technologies out there where you're like, maybe we think of like battery storage, and you're like, hey, if somebody could make a huge leap in battery storage, everyone immediately sees that as like unblocking some big particular problems. Whereas if you make a really nice set of glasses that you put on your face and suddenly you have augmented reality, at least as we've seen it in all kinds of demos, like Niantic has really cool stuff, or Snapchat, it looks a lot like a game. And there's not a lot of ways that are demonstrated that it really makes your life easier or better in these really practical ways. And part of it, I think, is, it comes to kind of sort of data as well as, let's say, spatial maps that are made for machines versus humans. So if you're a robot, or you're an automated Tesla or something in a Star Wars that scoots around on the ground, you have this system that's easy to imagine where you need a lot of sensors to see what's around you. You need some kind of probably preloaded map of the world, and a way to kind of rectify the two. So you generally have a model of a city. As you move around, there's dynamic things. You need to sense them. You may need to look at something and ascertain a little more information about it, like how high is that off the ground, or how far is that away right now, or is that door open or closed right now? The human mind's already really good at doing that stuff. So
Right.
augmented reality, like a lot of what you're thinking about is things like Google does now in their mobile app in the camera view. It shows you arrows in the camera that say, move this way straight ahead. You might see a floating pin in the distance that says the museum's back here, the one you're heading to.
Oh, wow.
I think it'll speak to you if you turn the volume on. It'll say like, turn left ahead. Not too different than you have now, but it tries to be a little more pedestrian oriented. And it even tries to use some waypoints. So it'll stay like, go up to the coffee shop on the left and from there across the street, instead of saying like continue 5 meters and then cross the street. So it's a little more personable, but in general, it's often not something that I think of me using in my everyday life, like waking up, wearing some kind of augmented reality glasses as I go out on a Saturday and explore my town or ride a train around and explore other places. I probably see it as like more interfering, or it would be kind of a novelty in itself. Like I might do it one time, but I'm not going to do it every day.
Right.
So that's kind of the challenge, right? But then there's again like this the idea of a paradigm shift. So maybe it goes back to something like Google Wave, where it's interesting,
right,
but it's a bit too much of like shattering the norms and the structures that I'm already used to.
Right.
But the problem you do have, one of the biggest problems, is it's just a small annoyance. If you ever walked around a new city trying to use Google Maps or organic maps or any kind of map app to get around, it's very annoying to constantly take your phone, look at it, okay, I'm here, and you walk a few blocks, and then you kind of really quickly forget, what was the street name that I'm supposed to turn at? Or how many, was it 3 blocks I should walk? And you check again, and you check again. And you keep doing that. And at the same time, you also have GPS problems. Like, as soon as you start navigating, you're like, do I go that way? Or is it behind me? And my camera angle's not really working yet. Right. So it's little annoying things like that I think are interesting, but it's still a big question, is like, how do you solve that by giving someone like a whole new way of accessing information that's different than a mobile phone?
Right. Well, and it's also, I mean, you just reminded me of a part of Echo's essay where he says, yeah, this is great. Every time I go back to this text, it's so good. So he says, the map. So again, we're assuming there's a 1-to-1 map overlaying a city, an empire, something like that. It says the map would represent a territory inhabited by subjects who in reality inhabit the map, unless it is a summary or impoverished map. So the point being, it's like you're mapping the empire. People are part of the empire. If the people aren't in the empire because they're on top of the map, looking at the map, they're no longer in the empire, right? So the map is not accurate anymore. But then he says, residing on the map, the subjects could not tend the territory, which would deteriorate, making the map unfaithful. It is necessary then for the map to be capable of being folded and then reopened with a different orientation so that every X of the map representing a point Y on the territory can be consulted when the point X of the map lies on any point Z of the territory. Anyway, it just goes on and on. And the insight here being that, like, if you are like living within this digital map, like we'll just use continue to use Google Maps as the example. You go to a new city and you're like, okay, my way around the city is through Google Maps. So it's like, okay, well, then you're going to be seeing what Google Maps knows about the city. That's not the city.
Yeah.
Like, profoundly not the city. And so I do sort of lament a little bit that loss, and I'll, like, just in my own life, because I've traveled a lot. You know, I've been lucky to travel to lots of different cities, and I find myself having to fight the algorithm. I'm like, oh, I got to go get dinner. Like, I guess
Yeah,
I'll find Yelp or Foursquare to like help me. I'm a Foursquare guy, right? I don't even know if it still exists, but like
it
I
does.
got to
Yeah.
use some algorithm. I mean, I know Foursquare exists, but like I don't know like the way it used to exist. Um, as like sort of a recommendation thing. Um, I need an algorithm to tell me like where to go eat, and it's like, all right. I mean, it's one way to live, but I'm maybe I'm just an old man, but I'm like I'm not sure if I really want to live that way.
Yeah. It's I think this is such a cool opportunity as technology starts evolving. Is like people very, very much are aware of the algorithm now, which is almost this meta thing. Like if you go back 10 years, people maybe like weren't so aware of, hey, like everything I'm reading on Twitter or Facebook or the ads that I'm seeing are kind of like this silo of my own just web of what's out there. And
Yeah.
someone else might just see something totally different and I don't have access to the way they see it. And at the same time, it's like everyone has kind of a different version of ads they see. That's one thing. And it's too personalized in that you're stuck in what the algorithm wants to recommend you. The other version of it is this kind of universal part. So if you go to Venice and I go to Venice and everyone goes to Venice, we're generally going to all get kind of the same nudges from an algorithm because it's going to be like people who visit Venice like to do this. And it's really hard to get off beaten tracks when you go visit somewhere these days because, you know, the Lonely Planet guidebook already had everything pretty nailed down as far as like, if you want to know what restaurants to eat and it's not in the Lonely Planet guidebook, you're either totally on your own or you play it safe and you only eat there, but so does everybody else. And that's just really been digitized and expanded, but
yeah,
it hasn't gotten any more diverse than that really. Like we just have a future version of it. But now that people are aware of that, I think a lot of people make the effort to like fight the algorithm or avoid the algorithm.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a whole kind of like existential approach to this is like people don't want to just follow certain patterns in their life, like relive out the exact, basically like a narrative of a story and have their story be the same as the next person's. They really want control over it. And that involves throwing a little randomness into things too. That's the interesting part that comes back to technology, but also literature again, is introducing that randomness is where things get really interesting and you break patterns.
Yeah.
So it's a cool opportunity, I think. And I'd say just the Google Maps kind of reinforces it. And a lot of people were looking for ways out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to see. I mean, how the algorithm shapes culture and how culture responds to it, right? And that's sort of a lot of like what Echo sort of talks about in his essay. It's like, look, if you were to do this, like it's going to change the way people behave, right? And that's also what we're seeing with you know the ever expansion of technology and the internet and stuff like this. And like, I think I can tell this story. It's like long enough ago when I worked at Amazon. I did a bit of work on the social responsibility team. So and we would do human rights impact assessments of technologies and stuff like that. And I got I this was not like my focus, but I got tagged to come join a meeting about the communication satellites that Amazon was working on. I mean, I think they just launched them. And they're like, hey, we're going to do human rights and impact assessment on you know these satellites. I think largely focused on like the supply chain, like how they're being made, and just making sure there's like no risk of human rights violations happening in the supply chain. And I never got invited back to one of these calls because I immediately took it to this weird place where I was like, well, isn't like, what is the impact of giving all sorts of people who haven't had access to the internet, like access to the internet? Like, if we have populations out there in parts of the world that have very low connectivity and we suddenly put them on the internet, like that's going to change what it means to be human in those places. The way like we're just like we were just discussing, like the algorithm's already like shaping people's behavior in all these different ways. I'm like, what about the impact of that on humanity? And they're like, we don't want to talk. They're just sort of like, oh, we're not going to discuss that. Like, just sort of like the impact on human rights of like the internet itself. And the assumption just being like, it'll just be good if more people get connected. Right. And that's a very common theme among big tech companies, of course, as everybody tends to believe that. I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad or not. I'm just going to say it just changes the way people behave. And it's fascinating to watch, to your point.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, a similar thing to that I think about a lot is, so where I grew up, there's no IKEA. It's very far away. The biggest major city is probably 8-hour drive away in either direction, Seattle or Denver or Minneapolis, Calgary.
Where was
this? In Montana.
Montana, I'm guessing.
So decent sized
I guessed
city.
correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah. Okay.
And so it's interesting because like spending a lot of time in Europe, especially, I start to notice places I go that that table on the balcony, that's from IKEA. I've seen that. And the furniture, like I now know like all these IKEA products that I see around. And so you can tell when you're somewhere in Italy and Portugal and Denmark when there's an IKEA nearby, because so many people's furniture, so many things in restaurants and hotels are all from IKEA. And so you kind of see the same flavor. And so then if you travel somewhere like Armenia, where there's not an IKEA, everything's very different. And so you're like, hey, this is a different culture, different language, kind of different region of the world. But part of it is just they don't have the same products here. And as soon as you open an IKEA somewhere like that, it will change. It will start to look like the other places. And so like that's a very non-digital version of it, but it's a very similar effect too, is you have just some things will plow over other things and become more prominent. And that can be bad, that can be good, right? So like you have really good things as far as like health and sanitation that may come, but then you might have just terrible music or like unhealthy food or something like that spreads it, and all range of things, right? Yeah. So that influence grows, and that's what's interesting about, you go to literature and ideas like these of Borges and Eco is Borges stuff was written in like the 40s and around that time. And so a lot of this kind of happened in a vacuum where he didn't necessarily have a ton of influence from other parts of the world. Independently arising ideas of like him imagining things like data structures and indexing that would be in a library. And then Eco, I think, responded to it decades later. But at the same time, he's still in kind of a not so connected world. And then you fast forward to now, and that kind of these two are kind of like discussing these things that are very much in their own context. But you get on Twitter nowadays or X, whatever it is now, and everyone's kind of aware of the same trending themes right away. And everyone can join the discussions. So things like Echo, 20 or 30 or something years later, criticizing Borges is now like an everyday occurrence as well. So it's interesting how those technologies that these two didn't foresee have also made debates about what's possible become much more real time and probably like similar to what they're doing. So it's made the world a lot smaller in exactly the way that kind of Echo was saying is impossible. Like you can't have a map that's the size of the whole world because it have to be as big as the whole world. But he didn't know about SQL and AWS and stuff like that, where it is kind of as big, it's just not physical.
Well, hold on. I'm going to push back on that a little bit though, because it's still not the world, right? Like it's just not really the world. Like
no, not at all.
And that's actually this is my note actually on that part about I lost that one I just read about like this idea that being like if the subjects are residing on the map, they will not tend to the territory. And I have this note I wrote in the margin is that are people on Twitter the same as people in real life? And they're not, right? It's like there are all sorts of people who they embody a persona on Twitter because Twitter rewards them to sort of behave a certain way or represent themselves a certain way on Twitter. that doesn't correspond to how they are in real life. You know, they're playing the part of a troll, or they're just doing jokes or something like that. My social media persona is almost entirely just like professional Jed talking about work stuff. You know, it's not, there's no way it's really who I am. And that's the thing we have to sort of like guard against, is this notion that like, the belief that these abstractions that we're creating that are becoming very compelling and addictive, and I mean, people can't get enough of them, to have them believe that like that's actually real life. And I think this is something you talk about in your fractal maps piece, that where you wrote about the Borges essay on exactitude in science, is that like you make this very funny observation that the way, I mean, it's funny to say like the way the story ends in Borges, because again, like for people watching on video, this is the story. This is it. Actually, I speak Spanish, so I read it in Spanish today. So Borges is hard to read in Spanish because he uses weird Argentinian like slang and like all sorts of terms that I'm not familiar with. This one was pretty easy though. But it says, in the deserts of the Est remain, discarded pieces of the map. This is just me translating in real time. I don't think that's what the official translation says. But and then you point out there are data centers out in the desert of like Utah. I know of data centers out in like Eastern Oregon, where massive volumes of satellite imagery reside. And you're like, oh, this is crazy. Like there are the map is actually literally in the deserts of the West. But it points, like, there's an interesting thing to observe here, which is that, like, sure, like we've distilled information, a model of the world, into something that can be stored in a data center in the middle of the desert. But it's still not the real world, right? Like the world itself is, I mean, it's just, it's very obvious to say this, but like you can't distill the world into bytes. I mean, you sort of can, and like presumably if you had enough, like you could, but it's not the real world. And just one last point on this though is that like you could probably theoretically like get to a point, I don't know, there's going to be some other breakthrough in storage technology where you can distill the world into binary information actually entirely accurately from the perspective of a human. Because there's only so much information that we can perceive, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then maybe you could actually distill that into something kind of physically small that's in a data center somewhere. But I would posit that it's still not the real world. It's all that we need, but it's still not the real world. Anyway, this
is where it becomes fractal, right? So there's kind of like a classic examination of this idea of fractal geometry, where it's like, there's a lot of this in nature and so forth, but in mapping, I think one of the examples was about the British coastline, and they're trying to measure how long is the British coastline. And it just depends, like every time you simplify your geometry, if there's literally just a curve, like on a very small section of the beach, I mean, literally this long as my hands are up, like 2 feet, half a meter, something. If you want to take the measuring tape and follow every little detail of it, you start adding like 10% or something to the length of it.
Right.
It's the same as like measuring, I'm hiking. I want to see how far it is from me to the hut over there. If you draw a straight line, that's 2 kilometers. If you follow the trail, that's actually 3.5. But how accurate and how detailed is that trail map? If it actually follows all the squiggles where it goes up the cliffside, you add an extra, like 10 minutes to your walk. And so you have this sort of infinite bit of measurement where you need to draw the line somewhere and say that's enough.
Right.
And eventually that becomes, as you said, like what's relevant to a human versus how far do you want to go on just over measuring. And if you want to take the whole world's measurement in LiDAR, for example, just a 3D imprint of the world, does your LiDAR need to have such a resolution that it might show individual ants crawling on a log when you take and load that up in a 3D scene? And can your machine even handle rendering that, right? I mean, the more that technology progresses, the more you can handle it, but then it's a question of why or for what purpose. And especially if you're a biologist and you want to take a scene of a beach and study like all the clams on it in a LiDAR model, that could be kind of cool. It saves you. You might just fly a drone really quickly over a beach and then load up in the lab, and you could go count how many clamshells have washed ashore without being out in the field. Meanwhile, if you map the whole world in that same resolution, it's a massive amount of data. When you try to open it, you have this thing that I think Echo couldn't conceive of when he's critiquing this one-for-one map, but it's an interesting concept philosophically, is you have an out-of-memory error. And
right.
It's like,
right.
What does that even mean in terms of, like it's like the concept of infinity that Borges writes a lot about, is you can't really conceive of it if you try to do it too literally, because it's just inconceivable. But it is there, and you know it's there, and you can take it in little pieces, but you can't see everything, everywhere all at once, like that movie name.
Yeah. Well, like, actually, which I still haven't seen. I really want to see that movie. This is the other thing that I think that this is kind of like a Library of Babel thing too. Is that like, you can imagine a scenario where you do have access to everything, and like, I've talked to many people throughout my career working in software. They're like, hey, like, I want an interface. I want something that's it'll have a database and it'll have all the information in it. And then I'll be able to like look at a dashboard and it will tell me everything I need to know. And it's just sort of like that, like, so, there's so many product, like, sort of like initial drafts of a requirement thing. It's like, give me an interface that will show me the things that I need to know so that I'll know what to do. And I'm like, that software actually doesn't solve that. And like, to your point about, like, it's like, you can map. Let's imagine a scenario where like we can map the world in very high resolution and digitize it in a way that would allow you to search it, sort of, but you still ultimately like have to decide what you want to know, and how you're going to behave based on what you know. And I think it's a delusion. And I think this is going to be a theme of this podcast, as I do have more of these conversations, that like, people believe that having better access to information will make them better. It'll help them make the right decision. I'm not sure if that's true. It can. But like, I think a lot of times it's a delusion. They're like, oh, I would be better if only I knew, if I had the right information. Yeah,
exactly. And there's, I don't know if you'd hear it in like a philosophy lecture, or you'd read it in just like a self-help book, or you'd read it in like a product manager guide. Is like, you eventually need to have this balance point that for yourself based on your scenario. So maybe it's you trying to launch a travel app where you know what is enough and where you should stop, or where you should not over optimize something or overload kind of what's in the dashboard, like you say, and just make a decision based on what's available now. Or else you get this paralysis by analysis, and you get bad user interfaces and things like that. So, and it kind of reminds me of this other, I think there was a physicist lately he's done a round of podcast interviews, and he had a book, blanking his name, but he was talking about this study they did recently. Basically, they were calculating the probability that as a human, your senses depict the real world accurately. And they basically claim to have proved there's a 0% chance that what you are perceiving using all five senses, as well as your knowledge in another sixth sense way, but like, there's a 0% chance that it's actually rendering to you the actual kind of topology of reality. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't make sense to include everything. Like, there's something always in every kind of model that they simulated where you get better results on, let's say, if you're out looking for strawberries growing in the wild, you get better results if you ignore certain things and you focus on plants and colors, and you're looking for the color red. You don't visually need to like understand what the sky is doing right now and like the shapes of clouds. Like, your senses are ignoring that. And it's the same thing. Like, it just doesn't make sense to overload. You come back to the out of memory error, but you also have this line of relevance. It's exactly the same in maps and geospatial technology. Is like, yes, you can always get better results by improving your data source and the resolution of it or something like that. But at the same time, if it's infinitely good, that doesn't mean you show that in the interface. Your interface is all about elegance of simplicity, of knowing what to exclude.
That's right. Yeah, no, and like you actually just you gave me the perfect opening. We talked before that we started recording, but that reading your pieces reminded me of some stories by this guy Simon Rich, who he's a comedy writer, and he has these collections of short stories. I love them. He's very, very funny. But he wrote a story called Raised by Wolves. This ran in the New Yorker. So if you search the New Yorker for Raised by Wolves, you might be able to find it. But it's about a girl who was raised by wolves. Like, she's a human, but something happened. She was raised by wolves, and she was able to write about her experience on her college admission essay, which got her into Brown, which is great. And but her parents come to visit at Thanksgiving, and it's always very annoying because she has issues with her parents. She has abandonment issues, and it's just sort of this examination of a girl who's literally raised by actual wolves, and then having a discussion with them about how they ruined her childhood. So they're having a debate about when her father left the family, and she's like, "It happened on my birthday," and he's like. She's like, "You don't remember this?" He's like, "Honestly, no." This great thing bear with me, but this is what Simon Rich does, is he has these wolves who are clearly wolves, but just talking like normal people. "Honestly, no," her father said. "So you're saying that I made that up?" I'm not saying that, he said, raising his paws defensively. "It totally could have happened that way, you remembered. I'm just saying my memory is different." "Okay, fine," she said. "What's your memory of the day you left?" "Okay, well," and again, this could be inaccurate. We're talking about something that happened a long time ago, and my brain is the size of a pine cone, and I have no understanding of time or numbers. But my memory of that day is, as I was walking through the woods, my memory of the day is I was walking through the woods, and then the big yellow god that lives in the sky shined hot, and then there was a smell like, okay, time to go, and so I ran into the wet place that is cold. And again, that might not be a perfectly accurate description of what happened, but that's what I remember. So
yeah,
this hilarious attempt at being what is it like to be a wolf? And I think it's always, I just get a kick out of all these sort of reminders to your point. And it's great that we've got a physicist who's apparently proven this, that the way that we perceive the world is, once again, like we've said, the map is not the territory. And so even the map, the model that we create for the world ourselves, as we perceive it, is still not the territory, let alone whatever abstraction a technology company can provide.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting from a Borges perspective on this. He has a tendency to explore the same idea multiple times in different stories. So there's the Library of Babel, and there's another one. I was reading about this earlier. I think it's called the Zephyr or something. And there's another one, the Book of Sands, I think it was called. And all of them are kind of looking at this idea of infinite text and infinity in general. But a really, really specific one that he does, that it's so simple and it's funny, but one of his most famous short stories that's not really a mind bender at all, but it's just called Street Corner Man. And
I don't know this one.
It's it's not really that notable one in a way, but once you think about it, he tells this very brief tale, and the way he writes about it is he does this in many of his stories. He writes about these things as if you're reading. It's like you're sitting around a campfire and someone's telling you a story that they heard from somebody else. So he's not saying authoritatively, this is what happened. He's here's what I heard. So the Street Corner Man is about this guy who's in a bar in Argentina, and he gives a lot of nice details about, what it's like in Buenos Aires at that time, which maybe it's in the 1890s or something. And some guy has a disagreement with another guy, and they agree to have a knife fight. Then they go outside, and there's this uncertainty at the end about what exactly happened, who stabbed who first, and how it all. We know it turned out that one guy came out victorious, but it's not really sure what happened in between. And
Yeah.
he gave one of the guys a name. I forget the last name now. It's Rosales or something like this, but he has another story that's like the tale of that guy, his name. And so he retells the same story basically, but almost like it's from another person's perspective who was also in the bar that night. And
Okay.
it's very strange because you're like, oh, he's telling this tale, but there's multiple takes on it, which is totally the way
Right.
that all kinds of popular mythical stories, things like that are. Like you have tons of different versions of the same story that come down through, maybe there's a fairy tale that exists in Germany, but there's also an Austrian version where there's like slightly different details. And yeah, it's just people remember things differently. They have a different perspective on it. The general gist is there, but
Yeah.
the more you try to get detailed, the more it just starts diverging. And so it's the same as like a map. Like the more spatial resolution you get from a different source, the more they disagree actually. So you kind of, to make sense of it, you zoom out to where it does agree, and you're like, this is generally what we're looking at.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, there's, I love this. I love this philosophy stuff. Obviously, that's why we're having this conversation. But like, I also acknowledge that like, it's good to just give people like the good enough answer, right? And that's what most people want. That's why these products are successful. But again, like it's a slippery slope. And I think a great example of this actually is what I think the latest Google phone, like part of the pitch for Google is like this, I think it's called Best Shot or something like that, where like you can take a burst of photos, and it'll just be like, hey, and you can just be like, hey, just compile the one where like everybody's eyes are open or everybody's smiling, and so you end up with a photo that is not a record of an actual moment in time that ever happened. But you're like, sure, it was. They were all smiling at around that time. And so, and I don't know how that's encoded in people's memories, certainly the way I encode data in my mind is not accurate really at all. It's really weird. So
yeah,
who's to say that like a photograph has like what makes a photograph accurate? I know Errol Morris has done a lot of thinking on this, that he's written entire books about this that I haven't read. But,
it's kind of like the super resolution idea in different kind of photographs. I mean, one is, there was like an advertisement from Huawei where they showed this amazing zoom on a phone where I don't know, he was like, somebody's zooming in on a building and there's a construction worker like cleaning the windows or something, and it just keeps zooming. And then there was somebody like playing with that feature, and they figured out that, the thing they're trying to take a photograph of, when you actually examine it, it's not really what was there at all, because it was using an AI to fill in pixels.
Wow. Yeah, so it's hallucinating. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the same from like satellite imagery. I mean, you have these experiments in academia of super resolution where you're like, hey, we can take a satellite image of an airfield that's a certain number of pixel resolution, and you can run this algorithm that will give you something that's actually 10 times better resolution, that looks crisper.
Right.
But it also used an AI to predict, you can see, okay, there's an airplane on the airfield in the real photo. When you zoom in with this super resolution, you can kind of see the edges of it, or like the paint markings, but they actually aren't really there. It just predicted like, this is what it would look like close up. And you get this distortion of reality in order to give you better resolution.
Yeah.
And the very same thing is kind of what comes into play when you get into 3D mapping that's used for something like augmented reality. Maybe very similar, something like NERFs, it's these neural radiance fields that are 3D modeling the world. And you kind of sample images and make a 3D scene. But in order to make it efficient, you don't want to try to like push all the pixels into a 3D model. You instead want to kind of take these really key points and reconstruct something like a statue, maybe in what looks like a Nintendo 64 graphic. And then the AI refines it into something that looks believable. And that's really helpful when you then want to say, overlay a 3D model of the world in your vision in augmented reality in a way that kind of matches reality. But again, it also distorts it in order to make it possible.
Right.
So there's these strange things that happen where, you lose sense of reality in order to have that over detail.
Yeah. No, it's where my mind just went was like, so Apple Maps is already doing this where like certain, remarkable art, buildings, like the architecture is represented in high resolution on the map. They've got these 3D maps of cities. Like we just went up to Vancouver this summer, and there's in case you haven't been to Vancouver, just spectacular architecture throughout the city. And there was one building in particular that I don't remember what it's called, but it's like some condo building, but very, very interesting piece, very interesting building. And Apple Maps represents it pretty well. Like they've done a good job of like making it look good, representing it well on the map. And I've noticed it with more sort of like features throughout cities. They go out of their way to make sure that like it's rendered nicely in the map. And it's easy to imagine a future where those buildings deteriorate or go away, and like the reality that we're confronting is once again actual reality, or rather the way that the way we perceive reality. But whatever, it's going to be different. The building will have been deteriorated, and we will, let's say like even like it's collapsed or something like that. And so then we have these very accurate digital representations of how the world was. And I think that's kind of awesome. I mean, I wish I could go back and see Egypt. That's always kind of like if you could go back in time, like I'd love to see some of the ancient cities at their peak. And we're actually creating a situation where like, well, future generations might actually be able to see that, which is kind of cool. Yeah. It's, you also reminded me of what Samsung did with its phone, where they're like, if you take a picture of the moon, they'll just like paste a high resolution image of the moon on it. Did you see this?
Yeah, that might be the one I was thinking of, like, that somebody was examining that zoomed in one. They're like, hey, this isn't actually the realistic depiction of it or something, right? Or they use somebody else's photo, right? Yeah.
It's sort of the opposite. I mean, it's like this is this is what the moon looks like. This is what the moon always looks like, And so, at least in our lifetimes, that's what the moon is always going to look like. So you can cheat in that way and say like, oh, that's the moon. Like, here's what it actually looks like. Same thing. It's like if you take a picture of like the Washington Monument or something like that, or or rather, if you create an augmented reality thing or some sort of situation where like you have a camera that's in a city detecting things and modeling them in real time. It could also just cheat. It should be like, oh, wait, you're in DC. That's the Washington Monument. Like, we already have that pre-rendered. Yeah. Like, we don't need to try to render that right now. Yeah.
Which is a huge part of augmented reality, really, is like, instead of rebuilding the world off of like a real-time camera sensor, just reference kind of this. I think I wrote about this as kind of like a railway track that generally you want to be on that rail as a guide. So you have kind of the foundations there. And then maybe in real time, you're sensing some extra details that you fill in, but it saves you time from like rebuilding a 3D model live on the fly.
Right.
Instead of referencing something and then just building 10% of it to fill it in.
Right. Yeah. And then you're going to end up with these weird edge cases where you're like, oh no, that statue was toppled, and so the digital map is out of sync. Well, let's start wrapping this up. But I want to point out, I think, a really interesting part of, again, the end of Borges' quote unquote story on exactitude and science. Let me see. In Spanish, it's called "de rigor en la ciencia," so of the rigor in science. So again, it's the last sentence. So it's like the map remains in the deserts of the West, inhabited by animals and mendigos, which is like, I think it's roughly like homeless people, like
mendicants.
I don't know how you translate it.
I think would be
mendicants. Mendicants. Yeah. And then, but this is the last phrase. And in the whole country, there is no other relic of the geographic disciplines. This is one of the things I love about Borges, and he does this also in the story Tlön, like Ukbar. I forget what it's called, but there's another fantastic story where he sort of describes like a country that was documented in an encyclopedia that no one's ever heard of, and it's sort of describing this other world and this entire other way of being. And this is kind of perhaps like the most mind-blowing part of this story that I don't think anybody does talk about, is that he's describing an empire in a world where people just gave up on cartography. They're like, we're done with that. You know, like there was a sort of a mania for it for a while, and they took it a little too far, and everyone's like, this map is stupid, we're going to tear it up. And people are like, we're done with maps. And that, I think there's sort of a thread between sort of what you've been talking about in terms of like the idea that the way we interact with maps right now is based on this sort of like 2D model, this representation of a map, but it doesn't have to be that way. And the way that we collect information and create models or abstractions of our world is arbitrary. Like, there could be a future where people are like, you know, this also, I've talked about Dune on other recordings of the podcast, like a Butlerian jihad idea. I don't know if you're familiar with Dune, but
a little bit.
In the Dune universe, yeah, there's this notion of a thing called that occurred before the story, called the Butlerian jihad, where people basically decide they don't want to. The computers are forbidden, basically. They develop conventions against using computers and what they call thinking machines. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Like, just the fact that like all the technologies that we rely on and we think are like actually helping us understand the world, future generations might be like, no, thank you. We're going to do it a different way.
Yeah. I think something to leave listeners to kind of go pursue also, that's an interesting thought of like diverging from those models or the algorithm, is this invented field kind of called psychogeography. There's this British guy who kind of started it, and I think they have an annual or every couple of years Congress of this somewhere in the UK. But he started it off by talking about how he tried to, he was giving a lecture in Boston. He's from London, and he tried to walk sort of all the way to Boston. So he described how he left his home in London and he started walking, and he tried to walk to Heathrow Airport. And the psychogeography aspect is like the way the city itself was designed in a real physical way, like not even digital. It pushes you to go towards certain things. Like the streets will all lead toward shopping streets or certain parks. And it's really hard for you to make a direct line to Heathrow without following the way that it forces you. And so he kind of came up with this idea of kind of going walkabout or something in a city, like try to just walk and see where you end up, and notice how the city tries to force you towards certain things, and what happens if you avoid that and go another way and take all these detours. And I think it highlights, in a literary way, in a digital way, like how there is this new understanding of how the technology sets a certain framework for us, whether it's maps or many other things. But the exciting thing now is becoming, finding like an asymmetry, or finding a way to get out of the algorithm, explore other things digitally, explore the things physically that the digital doesn't know about yet. And it's kind of an interesting thing that comes back to Borges, like the Ukbar thing you talked about. I think he had a part where someone invented that society, and then these other guys started coming in and inventing more parts of like the lore of that civilization that they didn't even really know if it existed, but then they just kept claiming that there was this happened and there was this king and this episode happened. And so everyone like starts living in this invented model of it and agreeing that it does exist in a way, but it's again distorts everything just based on agreeing on that single model that moves away from the actual reality. So it's psychogeography. It's a very interesting thing to look up and follow up on, and I'd like to write about that a little bit in the future.
No, you should. Well, so is that where I should direct people? Is to World Builder? Anywhere else you want people to find you, or is that of interest to you?
I don't tweet too much these days, but tend to share that there, but it's easy to subscribe. And I don't know, I try to write something every 1 to 3 months or something like that. And whenever something stimulates me, like this conversation will very much, then I'll lead into some night where I sit down and just hack out a new post and send it out. So if you're subscribed on email, it'll show up on your inbox. It's easy.
Nice. Well, thanks again. I mean, thanks for creating World Builder and spending the time with me to talk about this stuff. I love this. And yeah, I got to read, what's it called? Like Corner Man?
Street
guy in the corner.
Street Corner Man. Yeah.
Street Corner Man. Sorry. I'll have to look that one up. I mean, that's the thing about Borges. It's just like, I've been reading him forever, but I haven't read everything, obviously.
Yeah.
So, okay. Thanks for the tip on that. And then, psychogeography. Thank you. All right. And then one last thing, like what, is there anything that you've read recently or that you're, that's on your stack that you're excited about that you want to mention?
Let's see. I have books sitting around here.
Put you on the spot. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm a person that reads like 10 different books at once and skips between them. I think it works very well when I stop paying attention to something and come back. But I don't know. I think another author I like a lot, I'd recommend to people that I'm trying to dig more into, is Italo Calvino. And it's a very early version of this thing that I think they call like hypertext fiction, which is something like choose your own adventure. Yeah. It's like in HTML, you can choose one option or other, and then it'll go to a different page of the story. And I'm trying to find a lot more in his writing that's also inspirational for just ways of thinking about how technology might evolve and become more interactive, or let digital models of the world interact with the real world. So Italo Calvino for sure.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah, he's the Invisible Cities guy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Did you write it? Yeah. Which I've never read the whole thing, but anyway.
Yeah, it's perfect to read in parts for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that, and again, thanks for your time, and I'll send everybody to World Builder. Everybody, check out World Builder, and
great.
Keep it up, man. All right.
Thanks.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Chris was awesome to talk to. So much fun. And, ending on the note of psychogeography, which is like a whole other mind-blowing concept to explore. And it was just a great way to end the podcast. I'll be sharing a link to the Wikipedia article on psychogeography in the show notes. If you're enjoying this, if you're listening, please drop me a line. In particular, if you want to give me a grant to hire somebody to help me out with this, but otherwise just drop me a line. I'd love to hear from people. Always open to suggestions of things that we should be discussing, as well as people I should be talking to. Somebody suggested I should discuss Wittgenstein, which he's been on my radar for a long time, but I might take the plunge and read some of his work to discuss. So anyway, always open to new ideas and just love to hear from people. Thanks, as always, to Secret School for creating the intro music for Text on Text. And the outro music that you're hearing right now is called 3/10 the Population by We. We'll be back in June to discuss The Voice of the Dolphins by Leo Szilard. I'll be discussing that with George Dyson. He's an historian and author, but definitely an historian of technology, and just a fascinating guy. Really excited to get that one out. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you in a month.